We are rapidly finishing up the book of Ephesians, so turn to Ephesians chapter number 6. So, we just sang some of that great hymns of how great is our God. And we can say that God is great on Sunday. How about on Monday? Monday morning is coming fast and rapidly, and many have the idea of a Sunday afternoon gloom that comes upon them, knowing that they're going to have to wake up and Monday is there. The workday begins again. In fact, in the order of creation, we have this system of 6 days of labor and 1 day of rest, that we are to be employed in some kind of engagement. The problem is, our society and our world has deeply misunderstood what work means, what vocation means, what it means to be employed or have responsibility for another, what good works even means. Remember, as we were going through this, we learned the theological portions in the first half of Ephesians of what God has done for us, and the second half of Ephesians is how we work that out. He talked about husbands and wives and how we work that out together. He talked about children and parents and how we work out the theological truths of the gospel that God has done for us. Well, your work, your employment, your vocations is no less a way to work out your faith, an opportunity for good works, to put what you believe theologically into actual action around you. In our society, however, we have gone to extremes of two different extremes on two different spectrums. On one side, you have such things as anti-work movement. There are whole websites talking about anti-work, of trying to abolish work as an entity or as a thing, and as if there's some kind of utopia that's going to come where we just kind of, frolic around in a new Garden of Eden. The problem is any of those kind of communal systems that they talk about always requires intense labor. You don't just go out in nature and live in harmony and peace. It's us in some kind of fantasy realm. To quiet quitting, which is, I'm going to go to work and do the absolute bare minimum that I have to do. I'm not going to do anything other. In fact, if I can do less and still keep my job, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put no actual effort into this. On the other side, though, we have ideas and have seen throughout the ages corporate greed and abuse that have taken people. Even you think of those old coal mining towns where not only do they own the houses that the people live in, they own the store that they buy from, they own the shopping centers that they go to, they own everything about their lives, and their wages are not enough to keep up with what they charge in the store, and so as they work, they get more in debt, leading to the first labor unions that said, no, you're making us into slaves here. And so we have workers on one hand wanting to do the bare minimum, and masters on the other hand wanting to squeeze out the last bit of drop that they can for their own profit. Even if we don't live that way in either of those two extremes, we, in the middle, have a living for the weekend mentality. That what I do during the week doesn't really matter. I don't really care about it. It's something to pay the bills. It's something that can get me more toys so that on the weekend I can do what I really want to do. I can have fun. Billions are spent on lottery tickets for the hope of never having to work again. Once again, equating work, employment, to a 9-to-5 kind of mentality. And when we look at the doctrine of vocation, it is much larger than simply where you get a paycheck from 9 a.m. to 5 a.m. or whatever your hours tend to be. But we pass this on even to our children, this kind of idea of work, sometimes making work into our very identities. If you were to ask, who are you? You say, oh, well, I'm a chaplain, or I'm a service worker at a restaurant, or I'm the owner of a business, or I'm a computer programmer, or I'm a lawyer, or I'm a doctor, as if somehow your employment encapsulates all of who you are. And men, we are especially bad at this for those times where we've lost jobs. We feel that in our core and in our being, we are nothing. We are valueless when that happens. But we pass this subtly on to our children. We even ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? And what do we expect? We expect some kind of vocational job to come out of their mouth. Not what do you want to be when you grow up? What if they said, I want to be a godly person? That's not what we're asking when we're asking that question. We want to know what kind of job they want. We need to reshift and refocus. So this morning, I am not going to give you great business tips. I'm not going to give you all kinds of leadership skills of how to run a business or how to work for a business. That is for other experts besides the preaching of the gospel. But what I will give you is the moral imperatives of the doctrine of vocation. Let's read our text this morning. Bondservants, or some translations may say slaves or servants, and the disclaimer on that is we think of slaves and we think of southern United States chattel slavery. Now, chattel slavery means literally property slavery, that these people, they own them as if they would own a chair or a piece of cattle or something like that. That is not what is happening in the book of Ephesians. What is happening in the book of Ephesians is more akin to an indentured servitude of a number of years, either voluntarily or to pay off a debt of some sort. You think of people that join the United States military, and they are contracted for a set number of years, and they can't leave that contract. That's what it's talking about here. So if it's true for those under contractual obligation, how much more so for us who are voluntarily employed, where we don't have to stick around? There's no moral imperative that you give a 2 weeks' notice. If you want, you can walk out the door, and no police officers are knocking at your door saying you left your job early when you shouldn't have. So continuing on. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord, not to man. Knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them. And stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven. And there is no partiality with him. So this morning we have these moral imperatives. Remember, this isn't just employment tips, any more so than before he said, honor your father and mother as based on the 10 Commandments. It was moral obligation. These two, if you are a bondservant or a master, or sometimes in our day of middle management, sometimes you're both at the same time, these are moral imperatives for you. Meaning, violation of these precepts and principles are things that Jesus Christ even had to die on the cross for. He had to take on himself and pay the penalty for. So, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ. When you work for an employer, you're not just working for an employer. You're working for Jesus. Too often we have bifurcated the idea of the sacred and the secular, as if the only thing that really matters spiritually is if you're a pastor or a missionary, or some kind of conference speaker or an author. Paul here, God here, puts the onus that every single lawful employment is a sacred one, is a holy one, when carried out by his people. Because you are not just serving customers, you're not just serving your boss. When you do it with an eye to the Lord, you are serving Jesus himself. You're serving Jesus by making shoes. You're serving Jesus by doing your coding. You're serving Jesus by hammering nails into a piece of wood. You're serving Jesus by digging trenches and all the different things that you might do as a worker. When you dedicate it with the will of God from your heart, giving this as your service that's pleasing to God. So this morning, we're going to look at the nature of work and vocation and what that means. And then at the very end, we're going to look quickly at scriptures that outline how the worker and a master relationship should be. First thing we need to realize is that work is not part of the curse. When we look back in the Garden of Eden, before sin ever came into the world, what is Adam there to do? He's a gardener. He's a keeper. He has work to do. We are made in our being for work. Now, what is the curse? Because sometimes we think, well, from the sweat of your brow, you're going to eat bread. So isn't that a curse of work? No, that is a curse of toil in work. That work becomes laborsome, work becomes burdensome, work becomes unfulfilling and unsatisfying. That's what the curse is, but work itself is part of what we were made for, what we were created for. And once again, we're not just talking about a 9-to-5 shift that you take somewhere. In fact, in the new heaven and new earth, guess what we're going to be doing? Work. God has jobs. God has a purpose. God has a reason for us to be there, and there will be work continued into eternity. It won't be laborsome. It won't be toilsome. It'll be fulfilling. It'll be satisfying, but we will still be doing stuff. It's not this idea of we're just going to be sitting on the clouds all day strumming on harps. That is boring. I don't want to go there for all eternity. I don't want to go there for a weekend. That's boring. But work is part of our very creation. What we have done is we have defined work improperly, so we need to redefine it in its proper biblical context. Once again, we've reduced it merely to how we're employed. That our work is tied to where I go to for employment and a paycheck. Work is bigger than that. And when we've reduced work, what have we also done? We've reduced rest. Because we have reduced rest to mere recreation, to turning off our brain in front of the TV or the computer until bedtime, and then we do it all again and go to work, which is draining to us, and we look forward to that time when I can just sit on the couch again or in front of the computer and turn off my brain in this endless cycle that keeps on going. That doesn't sound much like living. It sounds like living in a zombified state of existence, a cycle of mind-numbing work and mind-numbing recreation until maybe someday, hopefully, you can retire. Or that's lowering work and the idea of vocation. Or we elevate it to be something it never should be. And when we're talking about vocation, we're not just talking about, once again, that employment schedule. We're talking about everything that you have responsibility over. So, sometimes you hear pastors, such as myself, Pastor Skip, as bivocational, meaning we are both pastors and we have other outside employments as well. And surely those are two vocations. But I'm much more than bivocational, because me as a husband is also part of my vocation. I have responsibility over it. Me as a father is another vocation that I have. Me as a citizen, me as a friend, me as a son, all of these are vocations that I fulfill because I have responsibility for. Every single person in this room, whether you have a 9-to-5 job or not, has vocations that are given to you by the providence of God. In ages past, they were referred to as your station in life, what God has bestowed upon you. So, sometimes we elevate work to those 9-to-5 work to be something it was never meant to be, as if it was the sole determiner of our identity and our worth. We need to be careful that we don't cover being a workaholic as if it's going to solve our issues and problems in life. Turning work not into its proper role of serving others and serving God, but turning work itself into an idol to fulfill us. Asking of work something it never could give. Work and being a workaholic won't help your marriage issues. In fact, it will make them worse. Being a workaholic won't cure you of your family problems. It won't solve unfulfilled needs that were put there by your parents. It won't heal the past traumas of your life. So, how do we view work? Well, first, every morally lawful vocation is honorable, valuable, and deserves respect. That service industry person, that waiter, that waitress, they deserve your respect. They're not just some kind of a slave there to do your bidding or will. Sometimes we can undermine this by saying, well, you need to go to college or you need to finish high school so you don't end up like those people digging ditches. Ditch digging is an honorable, valuable, and deserving of respect. It is a godly vocation. We must not ever lower anyone thinking, oh, well, doctor and lawyer, that's a good vocation. Everything else, oh, that's down here. We undermine God's direction of vocation when we lower the work of others that could be in service to God Himself, digging ditches for the glory of Christ. Man, since paradise, since the garden, was created not for lethargy, not for doing nothing, but for labor. We are to do, then rest, then do again. Even our daily cycles of sleep, let alone weekly cycles of Sabbath or yearly cycles of holidays, attest to this cycle of work, rest, work again. The problem is that even when we're working, we're not really doing. And when we rest, we're not really resting. We mix doing and resting into some sort of amalgamated monster that's really neither. And what do I mean by that? Well, when working, our minds wander to lust for resting, and our methods to cut corners and to take it easy, and to make work easier as if our work needs to be our rest. And when resting, our minds aren't usually on resting, they're back on work. Oh, I got to go to work the next morning. They wander to how the duties that we need to fulfill, or yearning or stress that more work needs to be done that I haven't fulfilled yet. We are never in the present. We do not live in our limitations, but seek to be in all times simultaneously. We want to be both at work and rest at the exact same time. Or, what we pass off as rest is really loafing about, being busy with other such activities of leisure that it becomes work again rather than refreshment for body and soul. You see, biblical rest, biblical Sabbath rest, it means that it's something that feeds us and our soul to get back to vigorous work again. It's not just doing nothing. It's not just vegging out and Netflix and chill, which Netflix is fine. But it doesn't mean it feeds your soul to get back to the labor unto God again. We, in fact, commit idolatry when we live as if we can exceed our time-bound limitations as mortals. We cannot do it all. We are not eternal nor omnipotent, and yet we act as if all things must be done by us all the time, or that more responsibility of the world hangs on us than we can really bear. Rather than Christ holding the universe together in His hands, such as it says in Colossians 1:17, we fear that all we hold dear, will crumble into oblivion if we don't allow ourselves to mentally stress about it constantly. As if our stress is going to somehow stop things from falling around us. Part of our problem is our own misdiagnosis regarding the creative order. What is our chief vocation? The very thing we were created and made to do. Our chief vocation is not as sub-creators. Now, we create things. Sometimes art is referred to as sub-creation, but that could be anything. Building a business, building a building, writing poetry, whatever you do in your work or job or vocation can be viewed as sub-creation, but that's not our primary vocation. And we are assuredly not co-creators. That is only God. Rather, we were placed in Eden as overseers and tenders of what God had already given us. Creating is good, but we're not creating new worlds. Our creations are only in service to the creation of God that He has made. The difference between what we do and what God has done as creation is so large that a different term than creating is probably useful, but at the very least, we could say that what we do in creating is a lowercase c and His creation is a capital case C. The temptation for creation that is not in service to God's creation is the same lure of promise to be gods given by the serpent in the garden. Creation in service to God is good. Creation to build our own world is enslavement under the guise of deification. Since our creation is under God's creation, then creation itself isn't our chief vocation. So, rather, what is it? Our vocation, no matter what our jobs might be, is as regents and nurturers of the providence of God. What do I mean by that? A regent is not a king. A regent is someone who acts for a king when one is not there. If a king, say, is underage, a regent will come in and he will administer the justice and he will administer the government until that young king can rise up and take his place on the throne. Well, we are not kings in this sense. We are regents of this world that God has created. And we are nurturers to make sure that what God has given us is going to thrive and flourish. We work against the curse that was placed on this world. Providence is that station that God has given us. What has God given you? The family, the community, the home, the job, that in His providence He has given you for your good. We are to be regents and nurturers of it. When we forsake the burden that we put on ourselves of becoming gods past the providence of God, we can enjoy the freedom of being truly human. How we treat our vocations reveals our true purpose, or our true response to the temptation of the forbidden fruit. Are we always grasping for more than what God has promised us? We either disdain the providence of God and the station of life He's given us, such as they disdain the providence of God and all the good trees that were in the garden that they could enjoy, or we grasp above our station for a role that isn't ours, that usually comes from covetousness and jealousy. Now, there are times when our station in life, and when I'm using the term station, not just employment, because this can go to all the different vocations in our life, can be onerous, can be burdensome, can be cruel. There are such a thing as cruel masters out there. And I've had jobs where serious, deep depression comes in, where some of the darkest times, I think, in our marriage, where I would go to work and be miserable, I'd come home and go straight to bed just so I could wake up again and be miserable. And if we have the ability to change it, we ought to. And we'll see that again later in 1 Corinthians 7:21, that it is okay to see a bad situation and try to move upon it into some kind of better self-improvement. That's okay. Yet, even in a harsh or unfulfilling situation, one should not think that God's providence is still not at work in your life. It is. Then there are times that we so love our station that we fear it ever leaving. And so we grasp onto it so tightly and we strangle the life out of the thing. In an attempt to keep it at all costs, we lose any enjoyment of that vocation any longer. We fear that if we but let go for a week, that the whole thing itself may die. Little backstory to some of this part of the sermon. I wrote this while on vacation. So while staring at the beach, I was thinking about these things. The reality is that if whatever your vocation was, whatever your job is, whatever thing you're trying to prop up with your own abilities, if it did die in but a week, it deserved to die. Many things depend upon you. Many things do. But all things cannot depend upon you. You're simply a mortal human being. As our chief vocation is regents and caretakers, then all of our vocations are really about His kingdom and not merely economics or influence. A vocation is not simply employment at a job, it is everything providence has given you the responsibility for. Spouse, parent or child, neighbor, employee or master, friend, church member, citizen. All of these are to be tended under our chief vocation for the good of God's kingdom. Our vocations are not something other than spiritual. They're what's tangibly spiritual. Our vocations are how we live out our supposed Christian ideals. You know, sometimes you see these cars and trucks like plumbers or something, and they have the little Christian fish by them to show that they're a Christian company. And that's great. I'm not against the little Christian fish, Jesus fish. But a question is, if we were to pop that Jesus fish off the truck, would their customers still know that they're a Christian company? Or is the only marker of it that little symbol that's there? Your vocations are how you live out your virtue. Your vocations are how you, church, do your good works. It's where it happens. Your Christian life and growth isn't something ridiculously private, which only occurs in some inner sphere of your personality. Private prayer and devotion are good, and part of your vocation as Christians. But it is in our public lives that we physically embody good works rather than only spiritually contemplate about them. The monks of old, for all their errors, they would also say this Latin phrase, laborare et orare, which means to work is to pray. In fulfilling your vocations is the opportunity to be thankful and accept God's providence in your life. You know, in the Lord's Prayer, it says, "Give us this day our daily bread." You know how He does that? In the vocations that He's given you. By serving well in those vocations, you thank God for giving you that daily bread. Balanced order of your vocations. Scold the temptations of our first parents, Adam and Eve, by saying, no, we're going to accept the providence that God has given us rather than reach beyond it. And loving service in your vocations, incarnate good works and expand God's kingdom. You know, part of our mission here is to expand God's kingdom. You do that by the vocations that you have. Okay. That's kind of the more heady theological stuff about what vocations are. Let's get very practical now by seeing how servants and masters ought to work together. So, verse 6, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. So your chief concern isn't to please your boss. It's not to please your manager. It's to please Jesus in how you're working. Rendering service with a good will to the Lord and not to man. Because the Lord will give back to you, it says. In 1 Corinthians 7, verse 21, it says, "Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself to the Lord. For he who is called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who is free when he is called is a bondservant of Christ." What he is saying here is that, you know what, if you're in a bad situation, there is a room to buy yourself out of that. If you can avail yourself of a better situation, of a better employment or life environment, by all means, take advantage of that. However, your identity in Christ is still the same, whether bondservant or free. Don't think that because you're in some job you hate or some vocation that is onerous to you, that somehow you have less worth in the eyes of God. Or that even sometimes that it's some kind of punishment from God. Rather, your status, that every person in the Lord is a free man of the Lord, and even those who think themselves free, we are bound as servants and slaves to Jesus. Your work is not a status or reflection of your spiritual value. 1 Peter 2, 18 through 24 says this, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust." Sometimes we think, oh man, they don't respect me here. And maybe they don't. Maybe it's the fact they don't. So we try to get back at them in little ways. They don't respect me here? Well, I'm going to take these pens home. I'm going to take some extra pads of paper. We are to do good not only to the gentle managers in our lives, but to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one who endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin, you're beaten for it and endure? If you do something bad and you're punished, well, that's what happens to people that do bad and are punished. But if you do good and suffer for it, you endure. This is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his footsteps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. Yet when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we may die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. 1 Peter 2, 18 through 24. Peter starts off talking about if you have a bad work environment and escalates it to the crucifixion scene of Jesus Christ. It's like, wow, that seems like a jump in my mind, but for Peter, it's one and the same. You being treated unfairly and unjustly at work is a way in which you show the gospel of Jesus Christ. That he set that example. Now, while it may feel sometimes like you're being beaten at work, most likely you're not being scourged and hung on a cross and spit upon. Jesus, however, was. And what was his response to that injustice? He trusted himself to the God who judges justly, the God who judges righteously. And so when you, even in your employment, do good to those who are unjust managers and masters, you reflect the gospel of Jesus. You embody the example that he set for us. This passage, while talking of Christ's suffering, is directly tied to the application regarding employees. So, what if, for some reason, you're unfulfilled in what you're doing? Well, first of all, become an expert in whatever your vocation is. And then when you feel you've mastered it, become an innovator in whatever your vocation is. Ask how can we do this better sort of thing. So, if you're an employee, if you're a servant, that's your role. Masters. If you're an owner of a business, if you have people under you in a department somewhere, if you're a manager of some sort, a president or a CEO, what is your role? Well, we saw this in verse number 9. Masters, do the same to them. So everything we've just said about servants, you do the same. You have responsibility over you. You have power. And with that comes the same stringent standards. And stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there's no partiality with him. There's not a God for the slaves and a God for the masters. It's the same God over all of them, and he judges without prejudice, without injustice. And even though here on earth a master may have more power, before his throne there's an even playing field. We must be very careful, recognizing that even if we are masters of business, we're not masters of the universe. 1 Timothy 6, 1 through 2, he gives this admonition to masters. Let all who are under the yoke as bondservants regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and his teaching may not be reviled. Those who have believing masters must not disrespect on the ground that they are brothers. Rather, they must serve all the better, since those who benefit by their good service are believers and beloved. Teach and urge these things. Now, I have seen in my life, even in church relationships, I have XYZ service, and I give it to a Christian brother in the church. And you know what? Because they're a Christian brother, I'm going to cut corners. I'm going to ignore deadlines. I'm going to kind of skate around the standards that they wanted to, or the contract or the agreement that we had, because they're Christian brothers, they're going to forgive me. And I have these other clients out there, these other customers. They need my attention, because this guy, I know this guy. I know this person. They're my friend, they're my Christian brother, they'll forgive me. These other clients and customers, they won't, so they get my full attention. Rather, the opposite ought to be true. If they are a Christian brother or sister that we're engaging in business with them, we need to serve them all the better, not the worse. If anything, our standards should be higher in how we give service to them, not lower. So in Colossians 4:1, masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. James 5:3-6 says this, your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and you will eat your flesh like fire. You laid up treasure in the last days. What in the world is this judgment that James is talking about? That your gold and silver are going to eat your very flesh. Well, verse 4 in James 5, behold, the wages of laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Holding back wages that are due, that are agreed upon, that are fair, isn't just an economic issue. It's a judgment of God issue. This very gold that they keep back instead of paying their laborers as they agreed becomes the thing that corrupts their flesh and burns them like fire. We need to pay as masters, as managers, what is owed, what is agreed upon, what is fair, what is just. Not taking advantage because we can. And with that fairness and justice also goes respect and honor, because they are created in the image of God, and their master is the same as our master. So closing this all up, both in how we should treat our masters with honor and respect, working as unto the Lord, and as masters, respecting and honoring the agreements with fairness and justice to those under our employment. Christ himself was faithful in his vocation. He had a vocation too. Jesus Christ came to save sinners. His vocation was to come in flesh and live a faithful life that we could not live. Despite the pain, the scorn, and shame he despised with drops of blood in the garden, he was faithful in the vocation that God sent him on. In his death, he defeated death. Through his work on the cross, his vocation was fulfilled. And he promises us life. We who are vocation breakers. We who do not morally live up to the standards of master and servant that are laid out in the Bible. Through his work on the cross, he took on the sinfulness that we do in our workdays and in our vocations, diverse as they may be, past our mere employments, so that if we trust in him as Savior, we have the forgiveness of sins. And just as he was raised, we will be raised as well. We fail often to be good masters and to be good servants. Jesus fulfilled both for us. And so as we come to this Lord's Supper, we remember that even despite the scorn and the injustice that he suffered, he trusted himself unto God. And that's what we do when we come to this table. We entrust our very beings unto God, remembering his death, his scourging, his cross that paid the penalty of our sin. At this time, Pastor Skip is going to come and lead us in a time of reflection and invitation based on what we've heard.
Thank you, Pastor.